Good evening. It is so great to have these two friends and gentlemen here with us today. I'm Ruth Mandel, director here at the Eagleton Institute. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to this year's Lewitt Lecture. Your program will note that the Albert Lewitt Endowed Lecture was established by a woman named Mrs. Benjamin Leon, and this was in memory of her brother. Nancy Herman, who is Lewitt's niece and represents the family, is, I'm very happy to say, with us today, and I want to acknowledge Nancy, who comes every year to the Lewitt Lecture, and say thank you. Nancy has told us that Mr. Lewitt was a pharmacist who got into politics almost by accident. He was asked by a friend to manage a campaign for elective office on the assumption, I don't know if there are any pharmacists in the audience, but this was on the assumption that pharmacists must know everything. And from that campaign on, he was hooked, and he ended up working on Capitol Hill in the 1940s. It was Lewitt who introduced his family to the previously unfamiliar world of politics and public affairs, and when he left a bequest to his sisters, Mrs. Leon established this lectureship as one way to share the same gift with others. And we have benefited from that gift because we've had a wonderful series of speakers here over the years, and they are listed in your program. And we continue to feel very grateful to him for the work that he did in Congress and for the legacy that he left. The annual Lewitt program has been honored by an impressive roster. Everyone in one way or another has been connected to Congress, including journalists who cover Congress. Today, we're extremely fortunate, and this is actually a first in the Lewitt series, to have not one, but two of New Jersey's most respected representatives in Washington, Rush Holt and Leonard Lance. We have some fun here playing around with words, especially my colleague Kathy Kleeman and I. And so today, with thanks to Joni Mitchell and Judy Collins, for those of you who know who they are, we've entitled today's conversation, Both Sides Now. And while our two guests are alike in some ways, they're also different. Congressman Holt, who is a Democrat, has served in Washington since 1999. He's represented the 12th District. His committee assignments have included Education and the Workforce and the Committee on Natural Resources, where he serves as the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. From 2007 to 2010, he chaired the Select Intelligence Oversight Panel. Congressman Lance, who is a Republican, is a relative newcomer, not to politics, but to the U.S. House. He was first elected to serve the 7th District in 2008. He was appointed to the House Financial Services Committee in his first term and now serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Before heading for Washington, Rush Holt, a nuclear physicist, was assistant director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. He holds a PhD in physics from NYU. Before he went to Congress, Leonard Lance, with a law degree from Vanderbilt University and a master's degree from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, was a longtime member of the New Jersey legislature. I know many of you knew him in that capacity over the years. He first served in the Assembly, then in the Senate, and he rose in the Senate to become the minority leader. Our two guests are similar in being, I know you know this, but for the record, awesomely intelligent and knowledgeable. They are moderate and gentlemanly in a Congress that seems increasingly combative. They also share a history of frequent visits to this very room, where each has been very generous in sharing his time and insights with our students and friends over the years. Our admiration for both has prompted us to invite them to return many times. And it is truly a personal honor and pleasure for me to welcome them back today. After a tough week in Washington, welcome to the two congressmen. We are moving from a format of formal lectures to more and more conversations, and tonight we're going to try a conversation with the two congressmen, and I'm going to ask a few questions, after which we will open the floor and you'll get an opportunity as well. I'd like you to be mindful of the fact that we are on a limited schedule here, and for both of them, but in particular I want to point out that Congressman Holt has not only taken the trouble to come here from Washington this evening to be with us, but when we're finished he's going back to Washington this evening. So don't mob him at the door when he's leaving, because he needs to get out of here. I'm going to start with a kind of personal question, open it up a little bit with a question for each of you. First for Congressman Lance. You spent many years in the New Jersey legislature before winning a congressional seat. So I've been curious, I know other people here are, what's the same, what's different about serving in Trenton versus Washington, D.C.?
First of all, thank you for including me, and let me go on the record to say that the smartest person in the room is Ruth.
Yes. I'll accept
that. We're joined this evening by my friend and mentor, State Senator Emeritus William Schluter, who is sitting over there. And Matt Holt, who is on the Freeholder Board in Hunterdon County and will be running for re-election next year, which means he determines the line route in Hunterdon. So I very much am interested in his continued support. And he is the grandson of Clifford P. Case, the last Republican to serve in the United States Senate from New Jersey.
And the namesake of a wonderful lectureship that we have the honor here at Eagleton.
Yes, a great graduate of Rutgers, Senator Case. What is the same, of course, is it is a legislative chamber. And as I'm sure your audience knows, both in the New Jersey Constitution and in the United States Constitution, the legislative chambers come first. The legislature is first in our state constitution and the Congress first in the American Constitution. And so obviously there are great similarities in that regard. From my perspective, having served in Trenton, the issues in Washington are national and international in nature. And obviously Rush and I concentrate on issues of importance to the nation as a whole. And in Congressman Holt's case, obviously, certainly regarding his service on the committee that deals with important international issues, those as well. And so I think the issue matrix is somewhat different. I have a great interest in New Jersey policy, but I also have a great interest in national and in international policy, and I would say that that is the primary difference.
Thank you. I hope we'll have a chance to get to a little bit of that, the international policy part of it. I know we're going to be spending a fair amount of time talking about domestic policy issues. I think they're on people's minds, but we'll get back and follow up. Congressman Holt, where I live and around the state, we see many bumper stickers that say, "My congressman is a rocket scientist," right? Everyone in the room has seen these. And it's true that you have not spent a lifetime in politics working in science right up until the time that you went to the Congress. How has politics changed you? Do you think that you as a scientist have had a distinctive impact on politics and on policy?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Eagleton and say that over the years I've attended the Lewitt lectures and admired the lecturers, and now I are one. So it actually is humbling. You've had it's a tradition that I I think we are both honored to take part in. It is impossible to do this job right without learning a great deal. There is an awful lot of wisdom among the 700,000 people whom I represent, and no doubt among Leonard's 700,000 constituents as well. Has it changed me from when I was practicing science? Probably not in the sense that you were asking, because my whole life I've sort of straddled the worlds of politics and science. My 7th grade teacher reminded me a few years back that when I was in the 7th grade, I had my own subscription to the Washington Post and Scientific American.
Oh, right.
And so it hasn't changed me into a politician. In that sense, I've always been interested in politics. I've been interested from my earliest memories in how the world works and how people get along. Science and politics. So it hasn't changed my character, but I learn a tremendous amount. And I don't mean just facts and figures. I learn an awful lot about what makes people tick, what it is that motivates people. I mean, that's, of course, what we're charged to do. If we're trying to decide, what tax rates we set, well, that's based on our understanding of what motivates people to work. At what point do you get diminishing returns at higher or lower tax rates? So it is this question of what motivates people.
Sounds a little bit as if there ought to be more psychology majors instead of lawyers and scientists in the Congress.
I'd settle for some more scientists, actually.
Would you? What is distinctive about being a scientist or a lawyer that is helpful in the legislative body at the highest level?
Well, depending on how you count it, there are 5 or 10 scientists in Congress, or maybe 2 or 3. Research physicists, I'm the only one. There were 3. We were on a growth curve that we thought was going to, when I arrived, Vern Ehlers, Republican from Grand Rapids, Michigan, was already there, and then we were joined by Bill Foster from Dennis Hastert's district in Illinois. We thought before long physicists would comprise the entire House of Representatives. But, actually, one retirement and one electoral setback has left me the lonely physicist. I think training in science is good training in framing questions. And that is an important skill. Of course, there are many things in society that have large technological components, whether it's telecommunications or space exploration, any number of the things that we vote on. But where I think it is most important is in those areas that have scientific components that aren't obvious. Things that are referred to the Science Committee are generally taken care of. But there are countless issues that have scientific or technological components that aren't recognized. One example I would mention is voting. You don't think of that as a scientific subject, and yet it became apparent to me, and I would say to other scientists that I talk with, that having purely electronic voting machines is dangerous. You don't have any verifiable way of testing their reliability. And we could go into that. But the point is, Congress passed legislation that encouraged states to move toward purely electronic voting machines. And scientists were immediately aghast at that idea, whereas lawyers and politicians of other sorts didn't see any problem. So there are lots of issues where I think a scientific perspective helps, and it's most needed in those areas that are not obviously scientific.
Is that, what is the percentage these days of lawyers in the House?
I don't know, but I assume the audience will think it's too high. Whatever it is. I do think it's important, Ruth, to have members who are interested in American history. Now, that's a little different from law.
Right.
But I do think it's important to have those who have read American history, recognizing that the day one enters Congress, one does not reinvent the wheel. I think there tends to be the belief that I'm here and now all things are going to change, and I do not share that belief. For example, this week was the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. And I had a discussion on the floor regarding that. And I think, incidentally, this week may have been the 50th anniversary when the Soviet Union first had a manned orbit.
That's right.
And lest we forget, in much of our lives, there was the competition with the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. So that history does change, and obviously we are involved in great national debates at the moment regarding the future of this country, and I think it's a good idea to be informed based upon the history of this country, and incidentally, from the perspective of a lawyer, constitutional law. And on major issues, certainly, I would hope on all issues, but certainly on major issues, I think whether or not there is a constitutional dimension to the issue on which I am voting.
And I should say it's always a pleasure to serve with Leonard, but particularly when we have the occasion to talk history. There are some actually trained historians in Congress, a very few, and a number who read it, but I don't know of anybody who has a better grasp of history than Leonard.
Oh, he has come into this room to talk to some of our graduate students as they were closing celebration, and always takes the opportunity to teach them something without notes. I have to say I would rely on notes. He doesn't have to rely on notes. And at the other level of ridiculousness, and I don't know if you watch this kind of news, but people here will probably remember in the last 24 hours, some of the coverage on the cable chatter has been about how Donald Trump didn't know that there were 435 people in the House, didn't know how many people there were. And
you're fired.
I want to switch to a subject that I know is near and dear to both of you. For a brief moment, we weren't sure that you were going to be able to get here because of the budget crisis. This was last week. We were concerned about it in many ways. The talk about how that played out and how close we came to a government shutdown is of great interest to us, and we'd be very privileged if you would share some of that with us. How close did it come? And also looking ahead to the next few weeks, where do you think we're heading with the debt ceiling issue? Is it inevitably linked to more deficit reduction, or can these issues be decoupled from your point of view? What do you expect will happen if Congress doesn't agree to raise the debt ceiling? So from just escaping a shutdown to the next few weeks, deficit reduction and the debt ceiling, give us a 30-second and knowledgeable. You want to start?
The House of Representatives is a majoritarian institution, and it differs in that regard from the United States Senate. And we are majoritarian for several reasons. First of all, we're based upon population, and Great Compromise of 1787 said that one chamber would be based on population and another based upon statehood. Also, the Senate has procedures that we do not have, such as the filibuster, cloture. And so in the House of Representatives, it is majoritarian. And the Speaker of the House, my friend, John Boehner, stated repeatedly that he did not favor a governmental shutdown. He favored cuts in spending. And I think that's almost verbatim what he said, and he said it repeatedly. And I don't know John Boehner well, but I'm getting to know him, and I admire his leadership ability, and I think he negotiated based upon principle with the White House and the President and with Senator Reid in the United States Senate. But the goal of our leadership in this majoritarian institution, where at the moment the Republicans are in the majority, and incidentally, it's better to be a sophomore in the majority than a freshman in the minority.
Yeah, that's right. I've tried it that way too. I would have to concur.
The goal of our leadership and of our membership was to cut spending, and certainly the goal of Speaker Boehner was not to shut down the government. My own view is that that is what eventuated due to tough negotiations. We voted in the House at about quarter after midnight a week ago tonight, so I think we missed the deadline by 10 minutes. We may have come close, but I think it was the sincere goal of Speaker Boehner, the leader of the majoritarian portion of a bicameral federal legislature, to cut spending and not to shut down the government.
Just on that last point, I was reading some history this past week that in 1936, when the House was preparing to adjourn, they kept setting the clock back while the debate went on.
Did you think they were going to close down?
The vote on the debt ceiling and the debate over the continuing resolution, they only share the point that each would bring the country to a crisis of government. Otherwise, they're very different.
Separate.
Very different, and I'll be happy to speak about each. The one that's coming up, which is to extend the debt ceiling, it's been extended many, many times over the centuries, is a matter of preserving the credit worthiness of the United States. It's not about the details of government operation, but if our credit worthiness goes away, obviously that has lasting consequences. The immediate consequences of defaulting on the debt would throw the government into crisis. I think that it is not a time for restructuring the economy or even rehashing arguments about how we got this debt. It's not a time, whether you believe that the debt is the result of unpaid bills from Reagan's defense buildup or excessive use of food stamps and social programs, or whether it's unpaid wars and tax cuts from the Bush administration, this is not the time to fix that. And that should be done through the usual process, such as we started today in the budget resolution. On the matter of the continuing resolution and the threatened shutdown of a week ago, it turned out not to be as close to a shutdown as I thought it was going to be. I used to think no one would ever want the government shut down. And then I saw demonstrators outside the Capitol last week saying, cut it or shut it. And there are some members of Congress who tend to be freshmen in the majority who were saying something like that on the floor. Some of them explicitly saying it, some of them implying it. So, you know, I realized that these are people who spent last year campaigning against government, and now that they are government, they don't quite know what to do. If it weren't serious, it would be amusing to watch.
Do you agree that they don't quite know what to do?
I think they know what to do.
Maybe they know all too well what to do.
And I think that they come into office very sincerely motivated and with a passionate belief that we need to right the fiscal house of this country. And I think that is accurate, that we have to do a much better job regarding fiscal responsibility. Now, how to get there is, of course, debatable, and we were debating that on the floor today with various proposals regarding the budget for the new fiscal year. Washington operates unusually. The fiscal year is from October 1st to the following September 30th. And so we began a debate on the budget document for fiscal year 2012. The prior Congress, the House of Representatives, did not pass a budget document. Right. For the first time since the Budget Reform Act of 1974, the House of Representatives did not pass a budget document. So we've had to go through the travail of continuing resolutions, voting for several of them, and then a week ago tonight, we finished that debate, and that was merely on a continuing resolution for the remaining months of this fiscal year. But I do believe that those who have been elected, and there are 87 Republican freshmen. This is the largest freshman class since 1948, and the largest Republican freshman class since 1938. Are motivated principally in a belief that we have to do a better job regarding fiscal responsibility.
So do I take it, as I want to move ahead a little bit, do I take it that both of you do, sitting here with some of your constituents, either specifically in your districts or certainly beyond here in New Jersey, that neither one of you believes that there will be, ultimately, that the debt ceiling issue will be not resolved, that we will not come to an impasse over that?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I actually, mistakenly predicted that a shutdown would be impossible to avoid because of the rather strong ideological positions in the continuing resolution debate. The president actually, working with Speaker Boehner, came up with an agreement that I didn't think possible, or that I didn't think it was possible until we found ourselves in a shutdown. But they did it sooner than I expected. So how is it going to happen?
So it leads you to be optimistic about the debt ceiling?
No, I was wrong before in my pessimism, but I'm still pessimistic about that, because I think that there's a sizable minority in the House right now that sees this not as a matter of maintaining the creditworthiness of the United States, primarily, but primarily as an opportunity to extract some changes that have to do with their view of how we got here. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, we all have ideas of how we got this debt. I mean, in fact, we have had debt for every year since 1830, here's the historian, 34, I think it is.
It was all Andrew Jackson's fault.
Andrew Jackson, that's right.
A Democrat.
Right.
Actually, it was Andrew Jackson. It was Andrew Jackson who ended the debt. So we can't blame that on him. And in fact, historically, it is actually quite clear that under Democratic leadership, the deficit goes down. But anyway, that's another matter.
We need better historians in the
But anyway, I think that people are not seeing this for what it is, or what I think it is, which is primarily a decision on whether the United States is going to maintain its stature and trustworthiness in the world, and rather they see it as an opportunity to extract some changes to deal with what they think are the causes of this problem.
I was more optimistic that we would not have a governmental shutdown last week. Regarding raising the debt limit, Speaker Boehner has said that it will have to be tied to other matters. I don't know whether it would be tied to the budget. I think perhaps it might be tied to some sort of constitutional amendment regarding debt in this country. Now, there are various amendment possibilities that have been discussed. There is at least several versions of a balanced budget amendment, but also there are other possibilities. Not having expenditures in the red beyond a certain percentage of gross domestic product. Historically, since the end of World War II, that level has been roughly 20% of GDP. It's now rising dramatically, 26% at the moment, I believe. And so tying, increasing the debt limit ceiling might not necessarily be to a budget document. It could be to a meaningful debate on some sort of constitutional amendment to limit further debt. And let me repeat that it would not necessarily be purely a balanced budget amendment. It could be something related to GDP.
So that is what you're expecting?
I do expect that. And the Speaker has indicated that in the last week, and I believe Republican members of the House are very much interested in some sort of constitutional component to the larger debt issue. And it does not necessarily have to be a balanced budget amendment.
With regard to, as we're moving forward, and the 2012 budget, and I'm going to leave that issue for a moment, and I know people will have questions and we'll pick up on some of this, but I want to get some things out. I do want you to comment on how you see the future on the entitlements issue of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and where that's going to come into this discussion. And I don't know how many crystal balls you want to look into, but whatever we could learn.
Social Security and Medicare are very different matters.
Yes.
And both very important to this country. In 1935, to be old, on average, was to be poor. In 1965, to be old, on average, was to get inferior medical care. Social Security changed the former, Medicare changed the latter. Social Security actually has worked pretty well and continues to work well with some changes. Everybody knows there's going to be a shortfall. Several decades from now, Social Security will no longer, several decades from now, will no longer be able to pay 100% of full benefits promised. It might pay about 75% of full benefits. That is not, for me, the description of a program that's fundamentally broken. It's a program that needs some adjustment, just as Social Security has had adjustment almost every year since 1935. And the scale of the shortfall, the size of that, so that several decades from now, every beneficiary can count on 100% of full benefits, is of order what was done in 1983 in the Ball Commission with the former Fed chair and others who were involved in that.
Paul Volcker.
And In other words, with some fairly minor, what we now think of as fairly minor changes that we've lived with since 1983, I beg your pardon. Some changes on the income, some changes on the outgo. Retirement is moving from 65 towards 67, things like that. Social Security, with some changes of that scale, only that scale, Social Security can be put on sound financial ground for the lifetime of any toddler today. That's Social Security. Medicare, on the other hand, runs into problems sooner. But my point is, it's not because it's a government program or because of the way it's structured. It is because healthcare costs are going up at 8 to 10% a year. There is no insurance program, public or private, that can survive that. And everybody hears about the insolvency of Medicare. I can promise you, in the boardrooms of the insurance companies, private insurance companies around the country, they're talking about insolvency too. You just don't see their books. The Medicare books are public. But if we continue to have 8 and 10% inflation in healthcare costs, there is no insurance program that is going to be able to survive. So that's why the health reform that was passed last year has one of its principal goals holding down costs. Now, you'll get a debate about whether it's going to work or not. There are a number of pieces that are intended to and directed toward hold down costs. And that's another debate that we're having right now as the House majority seeks to repeal the health care reform bit by bit or in a fell swoop.
The paradigm in Washington has changed. We're now discussing cutting levels of spending, or at least not increasing them to the extent that they would otherwise be increased. And I see a shift from the last Congress to the new Congress. And I think that the Republicans in the House have taken the lead on this with Paul Ryan's budget document. And now the President has responded. In his initial budget proposal, announced several months ago, there was not really any discussion of the entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I agree with Congressman Holt that Social Security can be reformed without massive changes. I've told the 24-year-old in our house that he's probably going to have to work until he's 70. He's 24. I've given him many, many decades of advance warning.
What about the 44-year-old?
I don't know what the limit will be, where the line in the sand should be, but I do think, given age expectancies, much higher than 1935, much higher even than 1965, that there are going to have to be changes gradually. In 1935, a lot of Republicans voted for Social Security. In 1965, a lot of Republicans voted for Medicare. This did not occur in the health care proposal of last year. A dramatic difference historically. I am of the view philosophically that the individual mandate, which is at the heart of the health care legislation, which incidentally I call the health care legislation. I do not call it by the name of any person.
Thank you.
And I am scrupulous. I am scrupulous in the press releases that go out of my office that we call it the health care bill that is now law, a bill for which I did not vote. I believe there is a significant constitutional question as to the constitutionality of the individual mandate. 5 district courts have ruled on that issue. 2 have said it is unconstitutional. 3 have said that it is constitutional. And I think there are other district courts who have dismissed the suit. I am the sponsor of a resolution with Randy Forbes, a Republican from Virginia who is on the Judiciary Committee, respectfully asking the Supreme Court to take the issue immediately, thus bypassing the various circuit courts of appeals. And there is a history on our side. When President Truman seized the steel mills in the spring of 1952, a district court ruled on that, and the Supreme Court took the case immediately. And in Youngstown Sheeton 2 versus Sawyer, the Supreme Court ruled that the president's actions were unconstitutional. Senator Nelson, a Democrat in the U.S. Senate from Florida, has a similar resolution. And I think it would be well advised if the Supreme Court were to take this issue, fundamental, I think, to determining how we should move forward on health care, and take it in its term that begins the first Monday in October, so that there can be a resolution prior to the 2012 presidential and congressional elections.
Do you suppose the president is counting how many additional justices of the Supreme Court he would need to appoint to bring a court that would...
I am sure he is, because he is a distinguished lawyer. And my view on that, Rush, is that there would be 4 justices on the liberal side who would likely uphold its constitutionality, 4 on the conservative side who would likely say that it is unconstitutional. I'm speculating here. And then Justice Anthony Kennedy, the person in the middle, might make the decision. And I pray every night for the continued good health of Justice Kennedy.
So President Obama would only have to pack the court with 2 more justices to be to be comfortable.
Based on my count, perhaps 1.
I've got quite a number of questions, but I'm going to limit myself to 1 more, because I really do want to give people an opportunity here to ask questions, and I know our time is limited. So I do want to, and you're a great example of something that I wish we'd all see, but the issue of bipartisanship. You know, I can ask this 4 or 5 different ways, all of them important and relevant, but I want to know if you think there are the sharp divisions in Congress are reflective of something real in the general public. Or do you hear among your constituents truly a deeper longing for bipartisanship that is not just kind of what we say, let's be bipartisan?
Great question. Leonard?
I think there needs to be more bipartisanship at the state level and at the federal level. And I suppose there is less bipartisanship than there may have been a generation ago.
Do you suppose, or did you experience it in the legislature, for example?
I was minority leader in our state Senate, at that point the ranking Republican in state government, because we had not yet elected a governor on our side. My relationship with the president of the state Senate, Dick Cody, was and is excellent. And certainly we had philosophical disagreements on issues, but when he became governor, I swore him into office in the privacy of his living room in West Orange. A great act on his part of reaching out to Republicans at an untoward situation in this state when a governor left office early. Part of the challenge in Washington is that by and large we do not live there permanently. Our principal residences tend to be in our districts, and that is true of me and of my wife. Our principal residence is in New Jersey. I believe Sam Rayburn, among the greatest speakers of the House, said famously that the jet airplane ruined Washington. And that is because members are expected home, at least in the House of Representatives, every weekend. And that is true not only if you live here on the East Coast, but it's true if you live in California. And I don't know how our California colleagues do it, because not only is there 5 hours to get across the country, there's also the time change once you're in California. But we do not live in Washington or Northern Virginia or suburban Maryland. Our children tend not to be on the same soccer team, and our spouses involved in school activities. And I think that is a difference from historically what the case was in Washington.
I think there are also a number of other similar factors that have contributed to what is unmistakably growing partisanship. And you can see this also in numerical analysis of the voting patterns. So there is more partisanship. I've observed it because I first worked on Capitol Hill as a kid 5 decades ago. And then again as a Congressional Science Fellow 3 decades ago. And although the progress toward partisanship was at a slow rate back then, it seems to be accelerating now. I have noticed actually in this year, the vitriol, the nastiness has subsided somewhat, but the partisanship, interestingly, is even greater.
What's your analysis?
I mention that because it's important to note that partisanship doesn't have to mean nastiness. But we certainly had a very nasty political climate over the last few years, all across the country. I don't mean just in Congress. We saw it in our town hall meetings. I mean, Leonard saw it, I saw it. It was a tough time. And maybe will be again, or maybe still is. But it seems to me that the tenor is a little bit better. But the reason, are there fundamental differences? I think I see some real changes. Now, you know, it was back under Reagan that there were people saying the government is the enemy. You certainly are hearing it now. You're not hearing it for the first time, but you're hearing it with a level of conviction that troubles me, that makes me think that there is a real difference there. The idea that you know, on your own you can make it just fine seems to be gaining ground, and I thought we started to put that behind us. Well, at least in the New Deal years, or subsequently. So I do see. I think I see a real difference, a real ideological split that is stronger than before. It's a noisy measurement, so it's not clear to me that that's the case.
I would comment that we now have a 24-hour news cycle, and we have cable news, and those who watch Fox tend not to watch MSNBC, and those who watch MSNBC tend not to watch Fox. I am told that Fox's leading program in the evening has about 3 million viewers, and the leading MSNBC program has slightly under 2 million,
half that, yeah,
or something like that. I'm also told that the viewership of Jersey Shore is 8 million. My point being that those who watch Fox are the most devoted in that segment of the population, and those who watch MSNBC as well, and never the twain shall meet. But it is not a high percentage of the American people. And I believe this 24-hour news cycle means that those who tend to be on cable television are very vigorous in their views. And
except when we're on.
I don't get invited.
Is that right?
I have been on Fox Business in New York, and I think once in Washington. But I tend not to make news when I'm on television. I think that's probably based upon my own personality. But I do think those who are on Fox and on MSNBC tend to be extremely vigorous in their views. And the American people are, by and large, in my view, center-right. That's my view, and obviously there may be a different view by Congressman Holt. But those who view the cable news programs tend not necessarily to be interested in the views of those on the other side, although I do see some greater coming together. I think the Speaker of the House, Mr. Boehner, is an institutionalist. Mm-hmm. He believes deeply in the House of Representatives as an institution. This is his 21st year in the House, and I think he wants to make sure that his place in American history is based upon the House as an institution, and I've seen that in several ways, some of them public and some of them private.
I can't resist this. I wasn't going to ask, there's so many questions. I can't resist this because of what you just said. So how do you see, and this will be my last one, some of the differences between Speaker Pelosi and Speaker Boehner in terms of style, process, ways of dealing with partisan differences?
They both dress very well. One comment on the procedure.
He cries and she doesn't.
He's very emotional and he's proud of that. He, I believe, is in a family of perhaps 12 with 11 other siblings. His father and mother ran a bar. He's very proud of his roots. One matter of the procedure of the House, in the last term, and I'm not sure it was true in terms before that, but in the last term, the bills that came to the floor were under a closed rule. This means it was not possible for amendments from the minority side. This is
or the majority side.
Or the majority side. Right. We have moved to a different process. Not all of our bills are completely open, but some have been open and some are opened in a modified extent. And this comes out of the Rules Committee, a very important committee in the House. I think this is a significant improvement as between the last term and this term. I cannot comment on terms before that because I was not there. But for example, in the first continuing resolution, where the House voted to cut roughly $60 billion, that did not pass the Senate. But in that first continuing resolution, I think there were 90 hours of debate, and there were amendments made on the floor, proffered by both the majority and the minority. And indeed, one of the amendments that passed on the floor defunded an airplane engine. I voted for that amendment. The Speaker was on the other side of that issue. It was important to a neighboring district to his in Ohio. He permitted us to vote our conscience, and more important than that, he permitted an open rule.
Yeah. I think it would take more time than we have to talk about the differences. They are very different, Speaker Boehner and Speaker Pelosi, in almost every way. And she was a very strong, central, even controlling force, and remarkably effective. I mean, the amount of legislation that has gone through in the last 2 years, and I don't mean minor legislation, actually the number of pieces of minor legislation are greater, far greater than average, but major pieces of legislation, you know, setting aside millions of acres of wilderness and scenic rivers and workplace protections and not to mention health care and financial reform. So she was very effective as a speaker, but with a strong hand. She wrote a book a couple of years ago called Know Your Power. I can't imagine John Boehner writing that book. First of all, I don't think of him as somebody who would write a book, but also with a title, Know Your Power. He has had a much more decentralized approach to his Republican conference. It is interesting. Someone actually, a Washington observer, Norm Ornstein, the other day said, watching Eric Cantor pacing behind the speaker is almost Shakespearean. Speaker Boehner has shown the willingness to share power, and he's already in a few months been a lot more effective than many of us would have predicted.
I'm not going to name the character in Shakespeare who comes to my mind regarding Speaker Pelosi.
Are you going to say gender specific?
It would be of Speaker Pelosi's gender.
We might guess.
Yeah,
Well, I don't want to be selfish anymore, so I'm going to open the floor for the limited time that we have and call on some of you to ask your questions. So if you please, I'll go here first, then I'll go back to you. I'll work my way back, and I'll remember that there's this side of the room too, if I can. Okay, please. If you don't mind, please identify yourself for our recording.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Danielle Pritchett. I'm a PhD student in the political science department here at Rutgers, and I am a constituent of Congressman Holt. My question, I had many, I couldn't decide, but
Me too.
I decided to go with the elephant in the room of our great democracy, which is the situation of the District of Columbia. Recently, there was legislation passed that gave away the district's free responsibility to handle funds that are not federal funds, but indeed their own personal local funds. So I guess I wanted to hear what was your perspective, how did you vote on the bill, and then how are you working in your office or within your areas to either assist the District of Columbia to have some sort of state right or statehood, or if you are on the opposite side of the view, what are you working to maintain the status quo? Thank you.
Just so the folks in the audience know what Ms. Pritchett is referring to, in one of the votes we took recently to keep the government open, to extend the appropriations for the current fiscal year, there was a provision that said that essentially no money would go to the District of Columbia for health programs if any other money within the District of Columbia government was used for abortions. In other words, you could not, it was to prevent abortions in the District of Columbia using other than federal government money. I voted against that legislation. We didn't have the opportunity to vote on that particular piece of it. It's one of the problems we faced recently. It's one of the problems we are likely to face on this debt ceiling vote, where a number of things, maybe it's only one constitutional amendment, more likely I think it'll be a number of things will be embedded in this bill which we cannot vote on. I voted against that for a variety of reasons. I mean, one was temporary extensions to keep the government open aren't a good thing, and it should be done in a way that makes good economic sense in a troubled economy. And I didn't think it met that test. If you're from the Constitution, you can, depending on how you read it, you can find good reason to rule the District of Columbia with a very heavy hand with the 435 mayors in the House of Representatives. Or you can read it if you read it kind of in the larger sense that this country has moved toward giving more and more rights, expanding the franchise throughout its centuries, that the District of Columbia should be moving more and more toward self-government and be regarded, as it already is in some respects, as a state. It should be regarded as a state, I think, in its self-government and in its representation in Congress.
I voted for the continuing resolution. My principal motivation was fiscal, but I did vote for the continuing resolution. Regarding the larger issue, the way I read the Constitution, the District of Columbia is not a state, and I think that it would require a constitutional amendment for the District of Columbia to become a state. There are some people who don't agree with me on that, who believe it can be done statutorily. That is not my view constitutionally. And I think it would be very difficult for the District of Columbia to become a state based upon my beliefs as how it could become a state, and that is through amendment to the Constitution. It would require a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress and then ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures, and I do not believe that that is realistic.
And I would just kind of repeat, I think the history of America has been, or at least a major thread in the history of America has been the expansion of the franchise. You know, whether you're talking about women voting, African American slaves being freed, and being given the vote and due process, I think consistent with that, the District of Columbia would move toward the vote and self-government.
Thank you. Professor Nymark? Introduce yourself, please.
Oh,
For the record. You can, it's okay to say.
Edith Nymark, and I'm a constituent of Congressman Holt.
These are not plants, Leonard.
It's just where we live.
I will get a constituent of Congressman Lenz next.
The deficit can be reduced in many ways and over a variety of time spans. And I'm wondering where the hypothesis that it is essential to reduce it as much as possible, as quickly as possible, comes from. What evidence is there to support this hypothesis in view of the experience of England, which accepts it and is in big trouble, and on the opposite side, China, which as things go, lightning speed, has become a major world power investing in growth.
I don't think the proposals on which we're voting balance the budget quickly. Quite the contrary. I think that Congressman Ryan's proposal does not balance the budget
Ever.
not for a long time. I do believe the motivation on our side to have a fundamental discussion on this issue, and let me repeat, I think the paradigm has changed since the election, is based upon the fact that annual deficits now are significantly higher as a percentage of gross domestic product than has been the historical norm since the end of World War II. Now, obviously, there were higher annual deficits during World War II when we were fighting for our lives. But since that time, as I understand it, the annual deficits have been no higher than roughly 20% of GDP, and now they are significantly higher. And I believe that there is a growing consensus that we have to bring them down. I'm under no illusion that we're going to bring them down as quickly as I might like. I recently told a town hall meeting that I never thought I would be saying this, but I am. If the deficit...
Better check yourself. The camera's running.
This will not be one of those moments in southwestern Virginia with Senator Allen, who, incidentally, I think will be returning to the United States Senate, but that will be decided by the people of Virginia a year in November. I said at a town hall meeting recently, if only the deficit were $1 trillion this year instead of $1.5 trillion. And I never thought I would be saying that. But if we could reduce the annual deficit to $1 trillion next year, that would be a dramatic improvement in my judgment from where we are today.
You mentioned, Professor, the experience of Britain. We don't need to go that far. The experience of the United States, 1937. We thought we had the Depression licked and decided that we should cut back on stimulus. And the reason so many Republicans won in the election of 1938, I believe it was that you were quoting, was it not? Was because we dipped into another, essentially, depression. So you don't need to go so far away to understand that a deficit attention disorder can be can be dangerous. An awful lot of the debate recently has been about the fact that the Republicans have been trying to balance the budget by dealing with a fraction of the budget. 10 or 12%, and trying to cut savings in domestic, discretionary, non-defense spending. I think there's a bigger problem than that. It is that this has been defined, and too many Democrats have bought into this definition as a spending problem. The way this country has prospered, the way this country will prosper, the way we deal with our international obligations and our financial obligations is through growth. And what has troubled me so much about the debate in Washington in the last year or two is that the word investment has vanished from the vocabulary. Spending is bad. And that is dangerously mistaken. Whether it's education or research or infrastructure, investment is absolutely essential for our future survival, let alone prosperity. 1944, this country was in the midst of a war on two fronts. We were in debt like we had never been in the history of the country or ever have been since. And it would have been so easy to say in 1944, what kind of harebrained idea is it to pay people to go to college and pay their tuition for them to the millions? But we did it. We passed the GI Bill, sent millions to college, lifted up millions of families, and produced economic activity that more than paid for the GI Bill many times over. And so what do we have in this budget passed today that's going to, cut spending on Medicare, even as the Congressional Budget Office says it will increase medical costs so that Medicare beneficiaries will be paying a much larger share of a larger bill. And we're cutting Pell Grants so that they're not offered in the summers and the dollar amounts are less. I mean, just absolutely the wrong way to go. And I'm getting
Yes, you are getting the hook. What I'm going to do, I would like to give you an opportunity if you want to make another comment, but
another question.
Congressman Holt has to go back to Washington. So if it's okay with you, we're going to let him go. And if it's okay with you, we'd like to take another question. Would that work?
Thank you.
Great. So if we can stop for a moment and thank one of these two gentlemen. I would have said it at the end. I'll say something else at the end, but it makes you proud to be in New Jersey and to have these two gentlemen representing us. Thank you. Travel safely.
This was an enjoyable discussion, getting more enjoyable.
Can I tell them what you're going to do this weekend?
Sure.
He's going back to Washington because his 97-year-old mother and he are flying to her college reunion in Missouri tomorrow.
Tomorrow morning, her 76th college reunion.
Yes. I'd like to know, just in looking, if you'll just give us a minute, in looking at the hands that are raised, is there someone who is a constituent of Congressman Lance I could call? Okay, I'll go to you then. Sure. Please introduce yourself.
My name's Chris Cazal, and I'm a fourth grade teacher at Rutgers Preparatory School down in Somerset, and I live in Bridgewater. This is kind of on a sadder note, but I'm wondering, with what happened in the spring with your colleague out in Arizona, with the congressman who was shot, how maybe you've changed the way you meet and greet with your constituents when you're home.
Thank you. It's a great question. I know Gabby Giffords. We were in the elevator together Wednesday when the new Congress was seated, as she was attacked Saturday. And since we're in the elevator with our colleagues all the time, one usually doesn't remember that. And the only reason I remember having been in the elevator with her that day is that when she was attacked, continually on television was run the photograph of the Congresswoman with Speaker Boehner as Speaker Boehner was swearing in members. There's a reenactment of the ceremony for members who choose to have a private moment with the Speaker. And I can recall the suit she was wearing in the elevator Wednesday because I saw the photograph on television after the attack occurred. We have new procedures, and this is in coordination with the Capitol Hill Police, who are similar to the Secret Service. And when we are in our districts and holding town hall meetings, there are new procedures, and I will not go into detail on that, but we do have new procedures. Obviously, violence should not occupy any position at all in our society. The Congresswoman is extremely well-liked on both sides of the aisle. Her husband is an astronaut. He is from, I think, West Orange. Is it West Orange? One of the oranges. Mm-hmm. We are hopeful that she might attend the space launching, and we hope that she will return to Congress as soon as possible. Tragically, violence has occupied a position in our nation's history that I think is just horrific. Last night I was walking on 10th Street, and that is where Ford's Theater is located. And the house across the street where Abraham Lincoln died is now under renovation. And I've never been in Ford's Theater, and I did not go in it last night. I was simply walking on 10th Street. But I am reminded that too often violence has played a part in American history, and we all hope it never occurs again. And we are all of the belief as well as the hope that Congresswoman Giffords will be returning to the floor of the House sometime soon. Other questions of me?
May I take
Yes,
one?
certainly.
Okay. You've been waiting?
My name is Steve Levine. I'm not.
No, please, we're recording.
I'm not one of your constituents. I'm a constituent of Rush Holt, and I know where he stands on the question I'm about to pose to you, but I have a strong feeling that the budget problem and the deficit and debt problem that we have cannot be solved only by spending cuts. Because, for example, if we make significant cuts in defense spending. That'll affect national security. It'll also lead to a lot of unemployment of soldiers and defense contractors. If we go the route of making significant cuts in things like Medicare and all the rest, what's going to happen is that seniors and people who are about to become seniors are going to be so upset and angry that they're liable to decide to quit paying their federal taxes, since we don't want them to engage in an armed revolt. So my question is, do you believe that we can solve the problem without any increase in any federal taxes over the next 10 years?
From my perspective, tax rates are quite high enough. There is going to be a discussion in the Ways and Means Committee of closing some loopholes that exist. Now, I do not view that necessarily as raising taxes. Your question suggests you might be interested in raising tax rates. I do not favor that. I do favor closing loopholes, both in individual tax rates and in corporate tax rates. And the proposal for which I voted today suggests the closing of loopholes. That this is the beginning of a very long discussion. I'm proud of the fact that my side of the aisle took the lead in the budget discussions regarding at least broaching the issue of the entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, not Social Security yet, but at least Medicare and Medicaid. Whereas the president's budget did not at all. Now the president has begun to discuss the issue in a speech he gave earlier this week, but I frankly think it should have been part of his budget proposal. So I think there's going to be a fundamental discussion on closing loopholes, and that may not answer your question specifically as what you would prefer to occur, but I think that the Ways and Means Committee is going to have that discussion beginning this year.
Does that have any chance of doing $1 trillion worth of work as opposed to only a few $100 billion worth of work?
It depends, I suppose. But those who suggest the permanent repeal of the rates that were established by President Bush, even that does not bring in a tremendous amount of money. It brings in some revenue. I respect that. The compromise that was reached by President Reagan and really Senator Bradley in 1986 had two rates. I think they were 15% and 28%. And now we're having a debate in this country whether the marginal rate should be increased to almost 40%. I think that is what the other side of the aisle suggests. I think many loopholes were closed in 1986 with two basic rates of 15% and 28%. I would like to see another round of reform regarding the closing of loopholes. Now, what passes the House, if anything were to pass the House, obviously would not necessarily pass the Senate or be signed into law by the President. I remind town hall meetings that I attend that my side of the aisle controls 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government. We do not have a parliamentary system in this country. Some favor a parliamentary system. Woodrow Wilson favored a parliamentary system. I do not. I like our system. I think our system is infinitely preferable to other systems around the world. At the moment, my side of the aisle is in the majority in the House. As I view the landscape, we may go into the majority in the United States Senate, where we are at 47 members now, and the cycle the next time in 2012 seems to favor us as to the number of Democrats and Republicans who are running. I'm not counting chickens before the eggs are hatched, but one of the geniuses of the American system is that power is not reposed in any single branch of government or in the bicameral nature of the federal legislature in either house exclusively. And I think it's a darn good system.
I will, because I feel I need to go to this side of the room, I will end with a question from this side of the room,
Yes.
because we haven't been over there
Yes.
yet. So if you
Yes.
would say your name, please, this is the last question.
Thank you. My name is Dimitri. I represent the Daily Targum.
The what?
The Daily Targum.
Ah, that's the student newspaper. on
I
campus.
know your student newspaper, your fine student newspaper.
Thank you. In that sense, Mr. Lenz, just this week, hundreds of Rutgers students walked through the campus in protest of tuition hikes. In consideration of the present budget cuts, do you believe there is even a slightest possibility for these students to see their demands being met?
I presume these tuition increases are based upon what's occurring in Trenton, is that right? Yes. I will comment on that, having served in the legislature for quite some time and having been minority leader in the state senate. We have spent money we haven't had in New Jersey. Now, Washington does that all the time because we have the power to do that. We print the money in the basement, in effect, in Washington. Actually, it's printed in the Treasury, but it's printed darn near where we spend the money. And my views philosophically are that deficits of 26% of gross domestic product are unacceptable, and unless addressed will lead to a lower standard of living for our children, as there are rising nations in the world, not only China, but India and Brazil and other places. At the state level, and we have a constitutional provision in New Jersey that requires voter approval for expenditures, what we have done in New Jersey is spend money we don't have by having independent authorities borrow without voter approval. The 1947 Constitution, based upon the 1844 Constitution, said no borrowing without voter approval. And I can assure you the framers of the 1947 Constitution, who met here in New Brunswick at the main gymnasium of this great university, thought they were saying we couldn't borrow in New Jersey without voter approval, but that has not proved to be the case for 2 generations because these independent authorities have borrowed without voter approval. I put an end to that. The Lance Amendment to the state constitution, enacted in 2008, says no borrowing without voter approval. It's my proudest accomplishment in the state legislature. I'm aware of what the 1947 framers thought they were doing because my late father was the last surviving member of that convention. And he is rolling over in his grave to the extent that people in New Jersey are borrowing without voter approval, something we can no longer do. So I think our new Republican governor, Governor Christie, in conjunction with the democratically controlled legislature, are trying to get a handle on spending. The priorities, of course, are a matter of debate in the legislative process, and the Democratic Party controls, and controls quite handsomely, both houses of the New Jersey legislature. I do not know whether ultimately tuition increases will be included in the state budget, but I think it is the governor's primary thought that we need to rein in spending so that we can live within our means. And this is because we are in this terribly punishing recession that still exists in New Jersey with an unemployment rate above the national average. We have an unemployment rate now in New Jersey, I think at 9.2%, higher than the 8.8% nationally. And that in turn means that state revenues are not nearly as strong as they should be. I commend you for your involvement in this, and I would hope that students at Rutgers would lobby your state legislators to say, not simply we want more funding, but that why you think more funding, or at least levels of funding that have existed in the past, should continue, but also recognize that there have to be cuts overall given the nature of the state budgetary situation.
I will close with observing that it's good to see you're keeping up with the home front. And to repeat what I said before, which is it is, I think, a very proud moment for our state that among the members of our congressional delegation are 2 congressmen like these who've been generous with their evenings, and I think we promised that you could leave a little earlier than we're letting you out of here, but I hope that won't keep you from returning soon and often. It's been a pleasure.
Since this is being taped, I can prove to my wife where I've been. And this was true last week at midnight when she saw me on the floor of the House at midnight. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.